I see him. Yeah, the smartest room in the Tri-Cities.
Yeah.
Go John. I'm really excited to introduce tonight's speaker, Mike Carter here. He's a dear friend of mine. Mike has an intense and deep love for people. Even the other team's parents at 11U Little League, which is tricky because he and I have coached together.
And against each other.
Yes, it's true. He even invited them to, we had a barbecue and a doubleheader, and he invited the other team to our barbecue. This is Mike Carter. You know, it's been said that Andy Warhol taught the 20th century how to see. I would like to say that Mike Carter can teach us all how to play. And tonight he's going to do that through baseball. He wins graciously and expects that from his coaches and players. He loses and it feels like a win, although he and I do have one of the 2 undefeated seasons in BYB majors. Legendary. He's on my speed text for, well, baseball stuff, that's all. That's it, baseball stuff. He travels and speaks professionally. He recently went to Arizona and spoke on the new hold stat for pitchers and bullpens. I'm sure you all know what that is.
Oh yeah, it's really,
Mike's very excited about
really
that.
intense. Yeah.
And he and Jeff hosted an epic Game 1 watch party for the World Series, where we and our boys lost our minds when Freddie Freeman hit a walk-off grand slam. So what you're about to hear is stuff that he knows and he loves deeply. Give it up for Mike Carter.
Mr. Lehman, thank you for the 2 kind words. I appreciate that. Nate also didn't tell you that we are diametrically opposed in our fandom. He is a Cubs fan. I am a long-suffering White Sox fan. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But thank you so much for allowing me to be here with you guys tonight. I've been to a few of these. I've really enjoyed them. I hope to give you guys something that you can chew on a little bit this week and think about in terms of baseball. Our topic tonight is really going to be about the history of gambling in baseball. There's a lot of mythology around it, and I want to dispel some of that and help you guys see some of the reality of what those things are. Hey, could you switch the slide there? Hopefully it works.
Here we go.
That's a picture of my son Jack and I when we won said championship that Nate was just speaking about. And I've lived in Batavia for 20 years. My wife Katie's in the back of the room over here. My 2 kids are Ellie and Jack. Some of you have had my kids teaching. I apologize. Thank you, Mr. Barry. I've been a special ed teacher and administrator for almost 30 years in the western suburbs. I've coached in BYB for many years, as Nate pointed out. I'm on the BYB board for better or for worse, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. And I'm the assistant coach at the high school VHS freshman baseball team, which is an honor and a privilege to be able to do. As Nate said, avid baseball fan. I play in a lot of high-stakes fantasy leagues, which is ironic considering that our topic is gambling. So we'll talk a little bit about that tonight too. And I write for a couple of different websites and host a weekly podcast as well that delve into some of the stuff that goes into fantasy baseball. It's amazing how much money is out there in terms of gambling in fantasy baseball and fantasy football. It's pretty wild. Lifelong, long-suffering White Sox fan, as I pointed out already. Okay, so let's start off with a little thumbnail on the history of betting in baseball. It goes back to the very beginning of time in baseball. You go back to the 1840s and the 1850s when baseball was first being developed, essentially in upstate New York, and people were gambling on it already. In the 1870s, it was really common for players and fans alike in the stands to be having casual bets. Right, so you would be a fan in the stands and you'd be talking to the players. A lot of times, the fields back then, there weren't stands the way that we think of like Wrigley Field or we think of guaranteed rate. The fans were actually on the field. They were next to the guys that were fielding the ball at third base and first base, and they were heckling, and they were talking, and they would make side bets. I bet you don't get a hit the next time you come up to the bat. I bet that you'll strike out the next time. And they would take little side wagers and whatnot. At the end of a lot of those games, what they would do is they would pass a hat around, and fans would put money in a hat, and to the victor goes the spoils, as they say. The team would win the pot, and they would be able to split it up. And nobody thought this was a problem at the very beginning stages of baseball. Think of the prop bets that we make when you go to a Super Bowl party, right? Is it going to be heads or tails on the coin toss? Who's going to get the ball first? Whatever it might be. that was what these things were like. If you want to have an equivalent comp for that, it's a prop bet. The first ban for gambling, though, in the history of baseball came in 1865, which is also the year that the Civil War ended. When 3 players for the Mutual Club, I love the team names. If you go back and look at some of the team names, it's pretty wild. They were each given $100 to throw a game on purpose. When their manager and their owner found out, he was livid, would not tolerate it, and banned those guys. Now, you might ask yourself an important question here. If a player was banned then, were they done? Were they allowed to be able to catch on with another team? Back then, it was you go to the highest bidder. You could jump to different leagues, and people would pay you more money to be on their team. So you had what they would call jumpers, for lack of a better term, who would jump from league to league looking for a better payday. So that was the first instance where we had that happen. The first really big instance with known players was 1877, when Louisville ace pitcher Jim Devlin was banned for losing exhibition and league games for money. Now you might think to yourself with that too, that exhibition games, practice games don't mean anything, but they meant a lot then. These were exhibition games where these guys would go into other towns and neighboring towns and play good teams from there and play against those guys, and it was considered sacrilege to be able to cheat in that way and throw the game. So he was suspended for that, and they kicked him out, along with 3 other players that were important players at the time as well. Fans were stunned by this. They were shocked that they had gone to that level, and it led to the next generation for the next 25 to 30 years being really clean, or at least taking it more underground, where it wasn't something that was in people's face that they could see readily and easily. I think it was probably just under better disguise from the research that I've done. People were still continuing to gamble. The American League starts play in 1901, so the National League started in 1876. And the American League starts in 1901, and all of a sudden in 1903 we have this little thing called the World Series, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but the National League is the older of the 2 leagues. The National League was seen as the parent of the major leagues at that time. And in 1901, they're immediately hit with gambling situations. There are several instances where teams are arguing about who's throwing these games, who's making these side wagers. There was first allegations of point shaving, where they would just shave a couple of runs off and bet on overs and unders like we do on like FanDuel and the sports books now. And so they started doing that, but Van Johnson, who became the president of the league, who had his fair share of enemies, including Charles Comiskey, who we'll talk about at length tonight, he orders all betting to be eliminated from the stands, and everybody just laughs at it. He has no way to enforce it. There's no teeth to any of the rules that he comes up with, and people just continue to gamble. Nobody really cared. The National Baseball Commission, though, was established to rule on these issues. The National Baseball Commission was a group of 3, represented by the owners, who were making the decisions about discipline for players in the league, and also how gate receipts were split. It was at this time as well that, back at this time in the early 1900s, there were only 8 teams in each league. Now there's 30, right? So there's 15 in each, the American and the National League. Back then there were 8 in each league. If you finish in the top 4 in your league, there was bonus money for that, payouts for that, several $1,000s. And so there was always people trying to figure out, hey, we're in 5th right now, but if we win 3 this weekend, we could get back into that contest to be able to get some of that payout money. And so that's where a lot of the gambling stuff really kind of starts to take root in that situation. So the National Baseball Commission is important. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Thanks, Nate. Okay, so the first World Series is played in 1903. I was not there, much to the chagrin of my students who think that I was that old at that time. A bribery attempt is issued at Cy Young. Some of you might have heard of Cy Young. The most famous pitching award in baseball is named after him. He's the winningest pitcher in the history of baseball, 511 wins, which will never be topped. The next guy is Walter Johnson with 416, which is kind of crazy, right? So back then, pitchers pitched the whole game, no matter what the results of the game were. You might give up 8 runs, you were in there for the duration. It was very well known at that time that guys would throw between 150 and 200 pitches at a time. Now, you know, with the way that Major League Baseball is now, those guys would be taken out and probably castigated, right? So, his personal catcher, he had a personal catcher name, his name was Lou Krieger. So everywhere that Cy Young went, Lou Krieger went with him, he was his personal catcher. And Krieger finds out about the bribery attempt to Cy Young because Cy Young told him everything as his personal catcher. And he goes to Van Johnson and says, hey, these guys are trying to get us to throw the World Series on purpose. And Johnson loses his mind, as you would imagine, and rewards Krieger with lifetime employment in MLB. He worked for MLB till the day he died without a descript job, and also drew a pension for the rest of his life, even though he didn't meet the criteria originally to get the pension, because Johnson was so grateful that he had told him about the attempt. When pennant races were over, so keep in mind at this time too, because there's only 8 teams in each league, there's no expanded playoffs like what we have today, right? The playoffs start, we have 2 or 3 weeks of playoffs before we get down to the nitty gritty of the World Series, right? And then, if you won the American League, you played the winner of the National League in the World Series, and that was it. That was the playoffs. There were no playoffs. The only reason why we have expanded playoffs is for the gates, right? The gate receipts. People want to make money. That's the age-old question that we have, right? So pennant races would generally be over relatively quickly. You'd be in the middle of September and still have 3 or 4 weeks of games to play. And you would find that teams were trying to figure out who was going to be pitching in the World Series, and they were resting guys and whatnot. So players would ease up over the stretch in September, and gamblers saw this as a way to kind of fix games, to line their pockets with cash before they made larger wagers on the World Series. Makes a lot of sense, right? So you might go to a team that's got a 10-game lead with 8 games to play and say, hey, we'll throw you $1,000 if you guys lose this game on purpose. Just make it look good. Don't worry about the result of it, but we want you guys to lose that game. I got a bunch of money on this one. Lose this game, we'll make it worth your while, and then we'll get back together when the World Series comes and we'll figure out the next steps about what we're gonna gamble on there. So because there was no expanded playoffs, those last 2 or 3 weeks of the season were oftentimes rife for gamblers to be able to get their claws in the players, so to speak, and be able to get games fixed for themselves. Teams did favors for each other during these times as well. So let's say you have a player that's trying to win a league batting title for a $300 bonus back then, which is a lot of money. Team trying to finish in the top 4 of each league, as I said earlier, the first division money pool, etc. The example of this that I wanted to give you guys, it's not in the slide, but it's Napoleon Lajoie versus Ty Cobb for the batting title in 1910. Now, Ty Cobb, you might have heard of. He was one of the best players of the first half of the 20th century. And he was a known delinquent, I guess you would say. He was unkind, he was very racist, used a lot of slurs. He was from the Deep South. He was a very competitive player. He was known to file his spikes down and spike people on purpose. Just a really nasty, some would say dirty player. He also had the most hits in the history of Major League Baseball before Pete Rose came along. But everybody hated Ty Cobb. Everybody liked Napoleon Lajoie, who played for the Cleveland Spiders at the time. Now they're the Cleveland Guardians, right? I wish they had gone back to Spiders, but that's a whole other story.
So do I.
Yeah. But everybody liked Lajoie, and Lajoie and Cobb were locked in a battle last weekend for the batting title. So a bunch of the guys on Cleveland went to the Detroit, the team that they were playing the White Sox, as a matter of fact. They went to the White Sox guys and said, we took up a collection. They took $40 from each guy in their starting 9, so it was like a total of $350, $360. And they went to him and said, Lajoie likes to bunt. We will give you this pot of money if you play 20 steps behind third base every time Lajoie comes up. What does Lajoie do? 6 times in a row, lays a perfect bunt down third base line and gets six singles. Ty Cobb loses his absolute mind. Part of the problem with that was that they were giving away a car at the time. You know, it was 5 years after they invented the car, right? So Chalmers is giving away a car to get Cobb off of his back. He ends up giving Cobb a car too. Lajoie won the batting title because of his 6 bunt singles on the last weekend of the year. It's just those little things, right? So players would get together against guys that they didn't like and do a form of gambling in that regard, right? So MLB decides to name a commissioner. Judge Landis, in 1920, so that's important for our points too. So they have the 3-man baseball commission for a while, and then in 1920, after the scandal of 1919, which we're going to talk about ad nauseum here, they decided to name an all-powerful commissioner, and Landis he's a piece of work. We'll talk about him in a little bit. Maybe would you skip to the next one? If you have any questions, just stop me. I have a tendency to ramble, right, Katie? Okay. I'll sip up here for courage. Baseball players have long had a history of hanging out in homes of ill repute. For those of you who don't know, saloons, bars, pool halls, brothels, places where the local rowdy people hung out. Degenerates abounded in these places. It sounds like a great time to me. I would have liked to have been around in that time period, I think, and done that. But baseball players were historically not very well educated. And that plays a large part in some of these factors as well. Those places were rife with gamblers with lots of cash who were willing to buy drinks for players in exchange for information they could use for gambling purposes, right? So they want to know who was pitching the next day. See, we do this now. You can find all this information at your fingertips, right? You can go on your phone, go on MLB's app and find out who's pitching the next day. You can find out who's pitching on Friday. You can find all that information out. You can find out who's hurt. You can find out what guy is hiding a nagging injury. But back then, 110 years ago, 120 years ago, that information was not available. And the reporters did not talk about it. The reporters protected players, and that information was not known. But the players knew. And if the players had had one too many at the bar, they might tell you some information that you could use to win a big bet, right? They might tell you, oh, you know, Eddie Seacott's arm is hanging, he's not gonna be able to pitch for 2 days. And then when he goes out there and pitches, you bet against him, right? So guys would be able to do all that stuff. So, you know, players that were hurt, pitchers that were hurting, guys that were, alcohol problems were rampant at this time as well. People, they had a lot of free time on their hands. And so they were, those guys that couldn't play up to par and whatnot, that was information that was getting gathered in these houses of ill repute. So gamblers use that inside information to better inform their practices, which makes a lot of sense. And very few educated players at the time. General mistrust for those who were educated. Education was seen as a mechanism of control for the elite. So you would run across guys that were college educated, that played in the major leagues, who were able to negotiate their better contracts, who were able to negotiate a better place in the lineup because they could have a coherent conversation with somebody. Many of the players at this time were guys that were coming from, no offense to anyone in the room, but back of the woods places. Many of them could not read or write enough to be able to even read their contracts. They didn't know what they were doing. And so that becomes a powerful thing. It's kind of interesting because we see that in our country today too, don't we? Like, there's a general mistrust of people who are educated by people who are not educated. So this is replicated early on in this era of baseball. Thanks, Nate. Okay, oh, this was a little small. So this is the big first name of gambling in baseball. His name was Hal Chase. He was nicknamed Prince Hal. Nobody liked him. They called him Prince Hal in a derogatory way. He was known for being an incredible fielder. He was the first baseman, you'll like this, Nate, who did not play on the base, who actually played 30 feet off of the base to be able to field the position. Most first basemen just hovered around first base. They were generally immovable blocks of granite that were, large and immobile. Chase could actually move. It was quite athletic. He was also well known for having played on 5 teams in 12 years, which was rare. Baseball back then had this thing called the reserve clause, which meant that you were not allowed to shop for a better deal in that league. You were the property of that team. So when a team purchased you or purchased your contract in the minor leagues, you were stuck with that team unless they cut you and let you go or they traded you. You had no rights as a free agent to shop around and get your best deal. So this was a really important factor because players were generally viewed as property. They referred to them as property going back even to the 40s and 50s. Players were referred to as property. Here are documents of Jackie Robinson coming up through the minor leagues where he was referred to as the Brooklyn Dodgers property, if you can believe any such thing. So Chase was really subtle though. He was known for gambling with anybody who would have him. He would miss signs on purpose. He would drop throws. He would swing and miss purposely on hit and runs. He was the king of the hit and run, which is a play where a runner would start from first base and he had to hit the ball no matter where it was pitched, and he would try to hit it in the spot where a fielder had just vacated a space. He was really, really good at it. but he was also really, really a degenerate. And was really, really good at gambling and making it look like he wasn't doing anything that was wrong. And so he was known to have a litany of offenses that were harbored at him by teammates, of all things, and other players. He made no bones about his attempts to bribe other players. His manager was the legendary Christy Mathewson, who was seen as one of the more scrupulous players of his generation and kindest, and a gentleman player. He won 373 games as a pitcher before he succumbed to, he had poison gas in World War I and died in 1925. But he was a key player in some of this stuff too. Mathewson was so sick of it that he just sent him away. There was a month left to go in the season. He said, "We're done here. You're not playing for me anymore." And so he sends him away. Unfortunately, the league president, John Heidler, who was a Cincinnati native and a fan of Hal Chase, whitewashed the whole thing and allowed him back. The only team that would have him was the New York Giants, who were run by a guy named John McGraw, who was generally considered one of the greatest managers in the history of the game, along with Connie Mack during that time period, who ran the Athletics. And he teams with Connie Zimmerman to throw more games because, they think they can change him. McGraw's like, I'm gonna give him tough love and it's gonna change him. There was no change in Hal Chase and Connie Zimmerman. So he was formally banned with the Black Sox in 1921 after his career had already ended. There was nobody that was willing to give him a chance, even though he was an excellent player. Which brings us to Connie Zimmerman. Nate, you see I put him in his Cubs uniform here.
Thank you.
Yeah, I thought you'd like to see that. So this is Henry Heine Zimmerman. Some of the names are just fantastic, right, that you run across with this stuff. He played for 12 years from 1907 to 1919. He won the Triple Crown in 1912, which is a really rare feat. It's when you lead the league in home runs, batting average, and runs batted in. Notice that the home run totals were so low. There were a lot of places that had very deep fences and guys would hit a lot of inside the park home runs. It was not very common until Babe Ruth's time to see guys really hitting the ball over the fence. He was banned from baseball for 15 games, allegedly the 1917 World Series, with the help of Hal Chase. This is important because when the White Sox do it in 1919, there is some level of precedent for how to do it when they go about doing it. When he and Chase became teammates, they both had players on their team as well as others to try to throw games. They would openly suggest it to people and say, "Hey, we're going nowhere. We've lost 3 games in a row. Let's just lose this one too." There's a lot of documented conversations that they had with that. McGraw discovered it, goes crazy, says, "I'm giving you guys a chance." It didn't really work out. They got cut as well. And so Zimmerman never got a job after 1919 as well, even though he was of an age where he could have still been able to play and be a productive player. The sad thing about it is that both Chase and Zimmerman were both really, really good players. And they were tainted because of the fact that they were just always trying to make that next buck. Sip of beer for what? Oh, next one, Nate, thanks.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay, so we get to 1919, and there's this little thing called the Black Sox scandal. The White Sox, my beloved team, decided to throw the World Series for money. And so I wanted to give you kind of a thumbnail of the people that were involved that were not players. Arnold Rothstein was the alleged financier, and he was a known mobster. He was never directly involved, even though he was implicated. They needed somebody that had access to lots of cash, and he was it. For those of you who've read The Great Gatsby, when Fitzgerald talks about how a person could mess with the faith of 50 million people, and he's talking about Meyer Wolfsheim. Meyer Wolfsheim was a contemporary, a figure of Rothstein. It was meant to be Rothstein who he was talking about. A couple of other people that were really important in this place were Sport Sullivan and Billy Maharg. Notice that it's Graham spelled backwards. He changed his name to that. They were degenerate gamblers who arranged the financing for the players. Abe Attell was a retired boxer. He actually was the featherweight champion of the world before he became a notorious gambler. And he was Rothstein's bad man, the guy who did his bidding and got money for him and did the dirty work. And then Sleepy Bill Burns was a former player who was connected to Chick Gandil, who we're going to talk about tonight as well. And they had been teammates 10 years prior, and this becomes an important connection for the World Series. And then, of course, Charles Comiskey, who was the team owner of the White Sox, unfairly seen as cheap. The stuff that we know, the stuff that we thought we knew, was not exactly what we knew, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. Chick Gandil was one of the 8 guys on the White Sox who ended up becoming banned with the 1919 World Series being thrown. And he knew that he could not do that on his own. One player can't, can impact a lot of the game, but can't impact the whole thing enough that he can ensure that they're going to lose. And so he figured if he got a couple of starting pitchers and 2 or 3 of the offensive cogs to their wheel, that he could pull it off. And so he targeted a couple of players, which we're going to talk about. Eddie Seacott, Lefty Williams, Happy Felsch, and then Joe Jackson, Buck Weaver, Swede Risberg, and a reserve player named Fred McMullen, who just overheard the conversations and wanted in on it because he heard what was going on. He knew that he was not going to be able to get Ray Schalk and Eddie Collins, who were Hall of Fame players on the White Sox. Here's a key thing I said a few minutes ago about the level of education. Eddie Collins was making $15,000 a year. Schalk was making almost $10,000 a year. They were both college guys. They had gone to Comiskey and they had said, I know this guy makes this at my position. I'm better than this guy. I should make more money than this guy. And Comiskey was like, yeah, you're right. You should. And we'll do that. The guys that weren't as bright as those guys, that were not educated, would sign whatever they put in front of them, right? Chick Gandil, as a matter of fact, was so evil, such an evil person, that these guys were paid by the month. They didn't have like we think of Shohei Ohtani and his $700 million contract and how that's paid out over the course of time. These guys got paid by the month. And so at any time, a team could decide to dump them and they would be out their next month's salary unless somebody else picked them up. Gandil was so evil, you know what he signed for per month? $666. I'm not kidding. It's documented. Like, you can look that up and you'd be like, whoa, that's a little bit weird. $666 and 67 cents was his contract per month. And that hadn't changed for the last 4 years before he threw the World Series. But he knew that if he was going to do it, he needed to get other people in on it. And Schalk and Collins were educated, and they did not like Gandil. And a lot of people did not. So we'll talk a little bit about that too. Well, this didn't show up as good as I wanted it to. So the 8 guys, just quick thumbnails on the 8 guys that ended up getting banned as for their interaction with the World Series in 1919. Charles Chick Gandil was the organizer. Shoeless Joe Jackson, we'll talk about him. Shakespearean tragedy, really. He would have been a Hall of Fame player if he had not done what he did. Eddie Seacott was the ace of the pitching staff. Claude Lefty Williams was the other really great pitcher that they had. Charles Swede Risberg was a weak-hitting, strong-arm shortstop. We've seen that story before in baseball. George Buck Weaver was an all-star third baseman. He was considered to be the best third baseman in the American League at this time. Fred McMullen was a utility player, but was so trusted by Comiskey that when it got time to go to the World Series, Comiskey sent McMullen to scout the Reds because he trusted his opinion so much that he sent him to scout them a week before the World Series started and wanted to know their tendencies and their weaknesses. And finally, Oscar Happy Felsch, who was their starting center fielder. These were the 8 guys that later on became referred to as the 8 men out or the Black Sox. Oh boy, that came out small too. A lot of what we thought we knew, it came from a book that was written in 1963 by a guy named Elliot Asanoff. I'm 51 years old. I wrote my first research paper on the Black Sox when I was like 16, and I based it all on this book. Going back and reading that research paper is a joke now, because the things that I thought were true were things that were really fabricated for the purposes of selling a book. As a 16-year-old, I was naive to the idea that somebody would do that, and I had no idea. A lot of the things that were put in there were things that were not true. And so that book was called 8 Men Out. They made it into a movie, I think in the late 80s. John Cusack was in it. It was directed by John Sayles. It's a good movie, but it's not factually correct. And that's an important piece of it. Charles Comiskey was the owner of the White Sox, and the rumor and the thought process of the time was that he was a miser and that he was very cheap. And back then, we did not have access to the level of salary that these guys were making at the time. Now granted, everything is relative, right? You go back 100 years ago, 105 years ago, and the money that guys were making was relative. Babe Ruth made $10,000, for example, before he got his big contract, before he started swatting home runs at a prodigious pace. The White Sox payroll in 1919 was $88,000, which was the highest in baseball. So I want you to kind of chew on that for a second. Buck Weaver made $72.50. Seacott made $8,000. The only pitcher who made more money than Seacott was Walter Johnson. Walter Johnson made $10,000. He was the only guy on the mound who made more than Eddie Seacott. Happy Felsch, $37.50. Gandil, $3,500. Joe Jackson, $6,000. Williams, $3,500. Risberg, $3,250. McMullen, so on and so forth. Okay? Now, the players were not underpaid. I want you to get rid of that idea in your head. They were not. They were not mistreated by Comiskey. There was a lot of rumors that the White Sox were forced to wash their own uniforms. Guys, the clubhouses didn't have laundry facilities in them. Everybody wore dirty uniforms. Nobody was paying to clean them more than once a week. So there's all these things that kind of came out about how cheap Comiskey was that really ended up not being true. There was another, if you look at those salaries, one thing that I'd like to point out, the reason why Jackson was underpaid at $6,000 a year and not more like $8,000 or $9,000 a year was that there was this little thing in 1918 called World War I. And what happened was when the United States got involved in that, a bunch of guys that were draft age eligible decided to skip out on their teams and go and get jobs working in shipyards so that they could avoid getting drafted. And Joe Jackson, who had a wife and also supported his mother, was afraid that he was going to get drafted, and so he and Lefty Williams jump off the White Sox in the middle of the season, in the middle of the pennant race, and go work at a shipyard in Maryland. Happy Felsch eventually joins them and says, I don't want to get drafted either. So they leave, and they go to Maryland. And Comiskey is livid. He just lost a third of his starting 9 to the shipyards to avoid getting drafted. He then tells them that they are no longer welcome on the team, and because of the reserve clause, he's allowed to put them on a list and not play them or pay them, and no other team can have them unless he decides to trade them, which he's not going to do. The next year comes around, the war ends, right? And November of 1918, right? So 1919 season rolls around, and the Sox manager, Kid Gleason, says, hey, let me talk to you, Charlie. We really could use those guys. Those guys are pretty good players. We could really use those. Let's bring them back. And Comiskey's like, no way. If I do, I'm only going to give them back. This is going to be like a prove-it salary. So you guys hear about players nowadays that get pillow contracts, guys that were hurt, or guys that have to prove it for a year before they can get a long-term deal, right? This is what the deal was for Joe Jackson. And Joe Jackson, even as great as he was starting to get on the downside of his career, which we'll talk a little bit about. Eddie Seacott, there's also been a rumor around him as well that Comiskey stiffed him out of a $10,000 bonus. Now Seacott was making $8,000, so a $10,000 bonus would have been a lot of money. The thing is that bonuses were generally handshake agreements, but then they would get written into the contract. If you did X, Y, and Z, and you got the bonus, how it would be paid out, it would usually be paid out over a couple of seasons, not in a lump sum, whatever it might be. Seacott had told people in his grand jury testimony that he had a clause in his contract that if he won 30 games, that he was owed $10,000 by Comiskey. Seacott later said in other testimony that that was not the case, and that there was no promise that had been given, but that he had gotten hurt and he wasn't going to be able to pitch for a couple of weeks. He missed 2 starts. In 1917, when he said he was supposed to get that bonus, he made every start of the year. So that was another thing that Asanoff had put in the book that simply wasn't true. There was no bonus. Comiskey said there wasn't a bonus. Later on, towards the end of his life, Seacott admitted that there had been no bonus agreed upon. So these are some of those myths that come up. Gandil and Seacott approach the gamblers, not the other way around. The gamblers don't come to them. They go to the gamblers and say, hey, we got an idea. Let's blow the World Series on purpose. How much do you think that would be worth? And the gamblers say, well, that's big money. We need to have somebody finance that we don't have that kind of money laying around. And so they come up with a plan that they're going to have to get somebody bigger to finance it, which is where Rothstein comes into it as a silent partner. And they say, we'll give you back then the World Series was not best of 7, it was best of 9. The reason why that changed was because that little skirmish called World War I, gate receipts from 17 and 18 were so down that the owners were losing their butts. And so they wanted to have an expanded World Series, ironically, to be able to try to recoup some of the stuff that they had missed. Comiskey's attendance in 1918 was half of what it had been in 1917. So he had lost a ton of money. So that's an interesting thing to kind of put into the thought process here as well. Gandil always went to his grave thinking that Comiskey had been cheap and that he was owed more money. The fact of the matter is that Gandil was on the downside of his career. He was 31 years old. He knew he was coming to the end of his career. And the other interesting thing about him is that he was from California. This guy was a really interesting dude. He was born in Minnesota, made his way down to Mexico playing baseball on mill teams and factory teams or whatever, and was so good that he went to California and played in California for the highest bidder. The Sox he played in the major leagues from there. The Sox got him 1914, 1915, but they never gave him more money than what they had to, because every year he threatened to hold out. He said, I like California, my wife likes California, if I find anybody that will pay me more money, I'm gonna jump to this league. And he says, fine, essentially, F you, find it if you can find it, but nobody was willing to pay him that because he wasn't good enough to be able to make that kind of money. So Comiskey was not gonna pay him a penny over what he had to pay him, which was really smart on his end. So the players were promised $20,000 for each game that they lost for 5 games, so they were promised $100,000. The media scrutiny began immediately because the White Sox were 3-1 favorites to win the 1919 World Series. And when the money started coming in and they were seeing it over the tape, they're like, wait, something's up. Because now all of a sudden they were even money and things started to change. The gambling stuff was being looked at, and the media picked up on it immediately. Something's going on here. Now, there had also been allegations that games in the 1917 World Series had been lost on purpose as well, which becomes part of this too. Okay, so the notes here for the World Series itself in 1919. The Sox lose the first 2 games on purpose. The Gamblers wanted to sign from Seacott, who was starting the first game because he was the ace. They wanted to sign from him that the fix was on. He said, I will hit the first batter. That's how you'll know. And this guy was known for impeccable control. He put the ball wherever he wanted to. And so first pitch he throws a strike, second pitch he drills this guy in the back. So all the gamblers and all the players know that it's on. So they lose the first 2 games on purpose. But they were promised that money. Remember, they were promised 20 grand for each loss. Well, after game 2, they only come back with 10 grand. And all of a sudden, the players are like, wait a minute, are we getting double crossed here? What's the situation? So they didn't get the money that they were owed. And so they decide to play to win game 3, and they do. And a matter of fact, Chick Gandil gets a 2-run hit. They won 3-0. He gets a 2-run single with runners on second and third and knocks in the game when he hits, right? So it was a proof to the gamblers of, hey, if you guys want to do this, we'll just win. We'll just go ahead and win. The gamblers were then put in a precarious position who were gambling on individual games as opposed to the whole series, which is dumb, right? They should have just bet on the series. They shouldn't have bet on individual games, but they thought they could make more money betting on individual games than betting on the series. Rothstein bet $270,000 on the Reds to win the World Series. Smart dude. Okay, so those gamblers lost tens of thousands of dollars when the Sox won game 3, so the gamblers then came back and said, wow, we better rethink how we're doing this, we better make sure that we get these guys some money. So unbeknownst to the other guys that were part of the scandal, Gandil had a second gamble that was going on with different people, where he was making money and then putting it up on his own and not sharing it with the other guys that were part of the scandal. So he had a second avenue of that. We know now that games 1, 2, 5, and 8 were lost on purpose. So best of 5 series, or best of 9 series, you had to win 5 games. We don't know that any of the other games were fixed. We don't think that they were, just because of the fact that the Sox won those games. You don't win games by accident. They won games 3, 6, and 7, and people were starting to become happy again in Chicago because they had won games 6 and 7 and looked like they were kind of coming back to life. The reality of it was that they hadn't gotten paid, and so they played to win, and they did, which is kind of wild. If you go to the next slide, Nate. The only player who got rich in the whole deal was Chick Gandil, no matter what he says. So on his deathbed, Gandil gave an interview to Sports Illustrated. He was 69 years old, with failing health, and he wanted to quote unquote clear his name, and all he did was muddy the water further. the word on the street, the rumors, what we think we know is that he made somewhere between $35,000 and $60,000 gambling on the World Series. The rest of the guys got very little. Seacott got $10,000. Seacott was the one who was probably most honest in his grand jury testimony. He had just bought a farm with his wife. He had 3 kids that were under the age of 5 and was worried about his next step, and he also had a sore arm. He knew that he was coming up to the end. He'd thrown a lot of innings, and he was worried about his financial future. And so he took the 10 grand. Before game 1, he found 10 grand under his pillow in the hotel room in Cincinnati. And he took that money and ran with it. And so he was the one who benefited the most besides Gandil. Jackson took 5 grand, Williams took 5 grand, Felch took 5 grand, Risberg 5 grand, McMullen 5 grand, Buck Weaver took nothing. He still was expelled from baseball. We'll talk about that in a sec. Here's the thing that's really funny. The winning World Series share in 1919 was $5,200. So if the Chicago White Sox had played to win, 6 of the 8 conspirators would have made more money than they had made playing to lose. Isn't that crazy? I mean, you think about it. They thought they were going to get rich off of it, and it just didn't happen. I mean, and that's what happens when you're not. I hate to say it. They weren't educated. They had no idea what they were really dealing with. Arnold Rothstein was the real deal. I mean, the guy knew what he was doing. He took advantage of these guys. This is Joe Jackson. And there might not be a greater tale of misery and woe in the history of baseball than Joe Jackson. How old do you think he is in that picture? He's 31. He looks like he's 55. Well, so do I. I mean, I look like I'm 55 too. But you can see their uniform, they were made of wool, and you can see in the black and white that it's dirty, right? That bat is what is referred to as Black Betsy. Does anybody know anything about Black Betsy? Maybe Coach Holm, you do? Know anything? No. So when Joe Jackson was a kid, and I think it's on the next slide, but I want you to look at the bat. You see how the bat's curved? That's not an error in the picture. That's the way the bat really is. You see, what happened was when he was a kid playing in the Mills in South Carolina, they figured out pretty quickly that he was a pretty good baseball player, and a fan made that bat for him when he was 15 years old, and he used it his entire career. That bat is made out of hickory, and the reason why it's curved is because the guy who made the bat didn't know what the hell he was doing. No, I'm not kidding. So what Jackson did is fascinating. He figured out, he couldn't read or write, but he figured out how to do this. He took that curved section and aimed it towards the pitcher, so that when he hit the ball, Babe Ruth said in a book that I read, that it sounded like he had hit a ball with a bag of bricks. And the ball just jumped off of that bat. He used 2 bats his entire career. In fact, he was so enamored with Black Betsy that he carried it around in its own case. He didn't let anybody on the team touch it. He didn't let any of the bat boys look at it. Nobody could point at it, nothing. Nobody could even look at it. But he wanted the bat to be black, and so what he did was, the guy who made it for him spit tobacco juice all over it, and slathered it in tobacco juice. And Joe Jackson, at the end of every season, you know what he did with it? He put it in a bucket of oil. Because he wanted it to have that dark look, and he thought that it made the bat wood harder and tougher. Maybe it did. In 1911, that bat cracks on the handle. What they did was he wanted it fixed. They told him, you can't fix that. He goes, well, somebody's going to fix it. It had cracked in the handle like maybe 3 inches up. So what they did was they figured out a way to bring it back together and like hot glued it, and then they took a staple that was like 4 inches long and drove a staple down through the bottom, the handle of the bat, the knob, and drove it all the way through to keep the bat together, and it survived the rest of his career. As a matter of fact, when he got old and somebody went down to interview him when he was in his early 60s and nearing the end of the line, Black Betsy was standing in the corner of his office. And the reporter knew that. He goes, why is that sitting there? He's like, well, it doesn't mean anything to anybody except me, you know. It was a really important thing. He did let Babe Ruth use it in batting practice a couple of times. And Babe Ruth was like, this thing is incredible. Here's the thing that's crazy about it. That bat was 36 inches, 48 ounces. Right? Right? It's like swinging a tree, right? Exactly. So that bat was really famous. It sold for, in 2016, Sotheby's sold it for $583,000. The only bat that sold for more than that was Babe Ruth's 1927 Hillerich and Bradsby bat that he used to hit 60 home runs in 1927. So that's Joe. Switch to the next slide, talk a little bit about him more. He's really the most important factor in the whole thing. I'll kind of speed it up here a little bit. He's the son of a Carolina sharecropper. He was illiterate, he could not read or write. He signed his first contract with an X. He married his high school sweetheart, her name was Kate. Thank you, Katie.
Good woman.
Yeah, good woman. And when they would be out in public, she would sign his autograph. So anything that was really signed by Joe Jackson is a collector's item because he learned how to read and write a little bit later on in his life to be able to sign his name and like balance his checkbook. He ended up running a series of cleaning businesses that were successful and a liquor store that bared his name as well. The shoeless moniker is real. He played a game, he had a pair of spikes that were too tight. They told him that he could not take his shoes off, he'd have to play barefoot if he did, and he did anyway, and he played shoeless. When he was first starting in the mill teams, he was a left-handed, so left-handed hitter and a right-handed thrower. He threw so hard that he became a pitcher right away, and in one of the first games that he ever pitched, he broke a guy's arm. And people were so intimidated by that they said they wouldn't play that team if he was gonna pitch. And so the other team, the team's manager said, well, I guess we could maybe see if you could hit. What do you think? He said, yeah, I'll give it a try. So he ends up becoming a very well-known player in the mills. Granted, get this, he was making $1 a week working in the mills. He was making $250 playing games on Saturday and Sunday. So you know where his future lies, right? He's pretty good at it. So the Athletics find out about him. There's a scout that finds out about him in the late 1907, 1908 time, finds out about him and goes and sees him play. And goes back to Connie Mack, who's one of the most well-known managers of the first half of the 20th century, and says, we gotta have this guy. Like, this guy is just a stud. And he's like, okay, well, what do you think? He goes, whatever it takes to sign him. So he goes to Jackson, who, remember, can't read or write. His parents are sharecroppers. He's one of like 8 children, whatever. Come up to him and say, hey, we're gonna give you $900. I'm gonna sign you to we're gonna give you $900 to play ball for the Philadelphia Athletics. And he's like, okay, that sounds good. But well, I don't wanna leave South Carolina. And they were like, well, if you're gonna play for the Athletics, you have to leave South Carolina. There are no major league stadiums here where you'll be able to play. So they send the scout down there to bring him back to Philadelphia. And he signs the contract with an X because he can't read or write. They say that's good enough. And they put him on a train, and then like 3 days later, the train arrives and he's not on it. He got off 2 stops later and went home and said, I can't do it. I can't leave South Carolina. I don't want to play there. So Mack had signed him, spent $900 to sign him and said, well, what the hell? He's not going to come and play for the Athletics. So he trades his contract to the Cleveland, who were the Spiders then. And Jackson decides that he's going to play there because he liked it better than Philadelphia. Philadelphia back in 1910 had a bad reputation for their fans. You know what it's like now, right? So long story short, they trade him to Cleveland and he hits like 408 the next year. Like just insane with his curved bat, right? So he's considered one of the best players of that generation, no doubt about it. Would have been in the Hall of Fame for sure. Lifetime 356 batting average. His OPS plus that's a stat that we use in baseball now to compare players at average. 100 is average. His OPS for his career was 170. So that means that he was 70% better than anybody in the outfield at that time, with the exception of Cobb. He was the best player for about a 5-year window when he first started. So things come to a head in 1920 when the rumors of the fix start to explode and players start to have a bad conscience about it. There was also a lot of rumors in 1920 that the White Sox continued to lose games on purpose for money. There are about a dozen games in question for the 1920 season where there was some substantial evidence that they might have lost the games on purpose for money. They were put on trial for a conspiracy to defraud the public. There was some grand jury testimony that was involved. Some of it was behind closed doors for the star players. So for Cicotte and Jackson and Weaver, their testimony was behind closed doors. And then it was lost. The word on the street about that was that Rothstein did not want his name involved in this, and that Rothstein had gone and paid somebody to steal that grand jury testimony that was sealed. And then it ended up being found about 10 years ago. I was telling somebody earlier tonight, a Chicago sergeant's family found it in a file cabinet in a manila folder, found all this grand jury testimony from 1920 and 1921, when the White Sox were on trial for gambling. Comiskey had heard rumors about the fix before the series even started, and he hired an investigator, quote unquote, to find stuff, and anything that they found, he suppressed. He didn't want to lose his team. He was rich beyond all measure. He did not want to have to answer for those guys being gone and try to find other players. He hoped the stir would die down, and it didn't. The National Baseball Commission then is dissolved, and Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis becomes the commissioner. And they get acquitted because the grand jury testimony is lost. There's a famous picture of them celebrating the acquittal with the jurors. Arm in arm, standing with their lawyers and the jurors, celebrating the getting off of the White Sox. They thought they were scot-free. We got acquitted, nothing sticks to us, we're okay. Then what happens? This guy here, flair for the dramatic, the shock of white hair, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, flair for the dramatic. This is what he said when he became commissioner. Now that I'm in baseball, just watch the game I play. If I catch any crook in baseball, the rest of his life is going to be a pretty hot one. I'll go to any means and anything possible to see that he gets a real penalty for his offense. And then on the right there is what he said when he banned the guys. The next day after the acquittal, he says, nope, drop, gone. And that's what he said right there. Regardless of the verdict, you guys can read it yourself. But he was a very dramatic guy. This picture was posed. He stopped the photographer. He was like, wait, does this look good? Is it better over here? What angle am I looking at here? He had a serious flair for the dramatic. He was named after a famous, I guess, Civil War battle on Kennesaw Mountain. His parents named him after that. Do you want to skip to the next one? How am I doing on time?
It's almost 8 o'clock.
Oh, shit. All right, okay. I told you. So Landis bars all 8 of the players, regardless of their involvement. The 1920 season had been rife with speculation that the Sox continued to throw games. The repercussions were that gambling was largely eradicated from the game by the example Landis sets, whether you think it's right or wrong. The public imagination was really captured by this. It was $5,000 worth betraying the trust of your teammates, your fans, the game. It played with the faith of millions of people, as we said earlier. A good thing happens, though, in 1920, that Babe Ruth hits 54 home runs. And that takes away a lot of the sting from people who are watching. That was more than a total for every Major League team that year. He had more home runs by himself than every team in Major League Baseball, I think with the exception of one. The guy who was second had 29, so he had outpaced the guy by 25. And this is the year where the manager says, I think maybe Babe Ruth should just hit full time and not pitch. So that happened at that point. You want to switch to the next one, Nate? We'll go quick here. My favorite, Pete Rose, Charlie Hustle, just died a month or two ago. It's a picture of him with his famous head first slide. And here's a picture of him knocking over All-Star catcher Ray Fosse in the 1970 All-Star game. I put a little caption down there. Did he have a bet on this one? Pete Rose was a notorious gambler, loved to play the horses, notorious scumbag, one of the greatest players to ever play in the history of baseball. He's an all-time hit leader with 4,256 hits, played the most games in Major League history, most at-bats in Major League history, had a .303 lifetime batting average, over 200 hits in 10 different seasons, and nobody does that anymore. All-star at 6 different positions. They needed him at different spots. He just played there. Known for his demeanor on the field, all-out play, and betting on horses, especially when he was younger, in his white patent leather shoes. So Rose becomes the manager of the Cincinnati Reds, the team that he grew up rooting for and the team that he first started playing with. And he was questioned by his gambling in 1989 by the outgoing commissioner, Peter Ueberroth. Bart Giamatti takes Ueberroth's place and hires John Dowd, fairly well-known guy, to investigate Rose. Bart Giamatti is also the father of actor Paul Giamatti. And Bart Giamatti was a really, really bright guy. The Dowd report, as it comes to be known, finds 52 instances of Rose gambling on the Reds while he was the manager at $10,000 a day. So we're talking about the guys going the World Series for a little bit of money. This is big money, right? Now, what's Rose's defense? Another uneducated guy, right? Well, I bet on us to win. Like, he thought that was okay, right? He didn't see that was a problem. Giamatti dies of a massive heart attack 8 days after he suspends Rose for life. But Rose accepts this. Now, this is important. A voluntary ban. He accepts it because he didn't want the criminal charges. He would have been charged as a criminal. He would have done time. He didn't want that. So he took the voluntary ban. So Major League Baseball would make no finding of fact regarding gambling allegations and cease their investigation. Rose was neither admitting nor denying the charges, and Rose could apply for reinstatement after 1 year, and everyone knew full well he wasn't getting back in. They never planned to let him back in, and he was also banned from the Hall of Fame, which is a tragedy. And then today, just in our situation today, some other scandals that kind of took place here. We had the performance-enhancing drug scandal, which is not gambling, obviously. The 2017 Houston Astros sign stealing scandal, that's for you, Nate. I name dropped you here. Nate's a big fan of the.
Where's the garbage can?
No. Nate is not a big fan of the 2017 Houston Astros. Spider attack controversy in 2021 with the ball grip. Shohei Ohtani's interpreter, Ipe Mazahara, embezzled millions from Ohtani last year for gambling. There have been a lot of people who thought that Ohtani was doing that gambling. There doesn't seem to be any evidence that that's the case. Ohtani has no idea how much money is in his bank account, just wants to hang around with his dog and hit bombs. Then last year we had another situation with gambling where a spare outfielder named Tucupita Marcano was suspended and banned for placing over 400 bets on the Pirates while he was rehabbing from a torn ACL. And he bet more than $150,000, mostly on parlays and over-unders on the Pirates to win or to lose. And he had inside information, which is why he was banned. So he knew things about the team that other people didn't know, and they banned him for life. They banned 4 other players for a year last year for doing the same thing. Guys can do this on FanDuel. Major League players are not allowed to gamble. They are not allowed to play fantasy baseball for money. They are allowed to play fantasy football as long as it's outside of the auspices of Major League Baseball and Major League clubhouses. I can tell you a story about that some other time. So those other guys got 1 year bans. Just the final slide here, Nate. George Will, famous columnist and author, said, "Baseball, it is said, is only a game. True, and the Grand Canyon is only a hole in Arizona." Baseball, there's something special about baseball. It is the American pastime. It's the first game that drew prominence in the United States. More than football, more than basketball, more than anything. It preceded those by 50 years. I think I wrote on, I can't remember what it says. Oh, it's rife with challenges. The game that survived attempts to manipulate and control. Yet the game marches on largely unchanged at the molecular level from the game that was played in the 1850s. It's still the same game. If you hit a 3-hopper to shortstop, you're going to be out if it's fielded correctly. It's never changed in 150 years. So thanks for coming. I know I went a little over time, but thanks for hanging with me. And if anybody wants a copy of the PowerPoint, I'd be happy to send it to you if you need any more information. I have some source material there. Yeah.